afternoon and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland and the first full Scottish from our new studio in Stirling. My name is Nadia Chand. On the programme this week, we are delighted to be joined by Campbell Gemmell in the studio. Good afternoon, Campbell.
Hi there, Nadia. Good to be here.
And we are also delighted to welcome Huw Marshall of Talking Wales coming in remotely. Good afternoon, Huw.
Good afternoon, Prynhawn da.
To start, we will be beginning with the Middle East update. Despite the ceasefire and the death toll in Gaza continues to rise with a total of 72,070 Palestinians killed and 171,838 injured since 7th October 2025 ceasefire. Approximately 2,252 Palestinians have been killed or injured. As Trump builds up his armada to attack Iran, his ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, has been criticized for saying it would be fine if Israel took all Middle East land. Campbell.
Yeah, it's extraordinary, isn't it? I'm amazed by these latest elements of the story. I suppose we've known for quite a long time that one of the objectives of at least some within the Israeli government has been the effective removal and annihilation of Palestinian communities, not just in Gaza but also on the West Bank. And this, I suppose, just feels like, from their point of view, a logical continuation of the strategy which the US has supported. But it's after everything that's happened, it's just extraordinary that it's still going on. I have absolutely no idea now, nor did I have in the past, of how this ends. I can't see a happy way forward, because this is not a property development proposal for the successful billionaires from the US to profit from in the Middle East. This is actually the home of large communities, and has been for thousands of years. So it's I think it's disgraceful. I think it's shocking, but none of these words really seem to mean anything anymore, given what has continued to happen.
Yeah, thank you. Huw?
Yeah, I'll just echo what's just been said. You just get a feeling of numbness from it all. It's the fact that Trump has set up this board of peace, which is basically another way of him getting cash in from some of the worst governments in the world. And the fact that Tony Blair is, associated with it and allows himself to be associated with it is an absolute disgrace. As you were saying, we're talking about people's lives here, their homeland that's been destroyed systematically by the Israeli government. And Trump sees it all as some sort of transactional real estate that he can just do whatever he wants with it. It just beggars belief. And I think we'll go on to discuss other things around Trump and Epstein, but it's all coming to the fore now that the world has unfortunately had a lot of very, very rich, very, very influential people, seemingly getting their own way for many, many years, and it just makes you wonder, how do we stop that? I've mentioned before that the United Nations, when I was growing up, was a force of strength. It's lost all its power and meaning. It's a pointless organisation these days, and something has to change. And hopefully that will start with the midterms in November, when the American people get a chance to start rejecting Trump and his absolute ghastly nonsense.
Yeah, thank you. We'll move on to the Ukraine update, and we will come back to Trump after this. This week marks the 4th anniversary of Putin's aggression and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The European Union is eager to begin Ukraine's EU membership talks as soon as possible, European Council President Antonio Costa has said, although he stopped short of setting a date. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban has threatened to veto the EU's 90 billion loan to Ukraine unless Kiev restores Russian oil deliveries through a pipeline on its territory. Ukraine authorities say Ukraine authorities say Druzhba pipeline was shut down after being damaged during a Russian attack in January, angering Kremlin allies Orban and the Slovakian Prime Minister Robert Fico. Ukraine's Foreign Minister has condemned what it describes as ultimatums and blackmail by Hungary and Slovakia on Saturday after both governments threatened to stop electricity supplies to Ukraine unless Kiev restarts flows of Russian oil. Hungary has also threatened to block a 90 billion Ukrainian war loan. Russia attacked Ukraine overnight with dozens of strike drones and ballistic and cruise missiles focusing on energy infrastructure, officials said on Sunday. The strikes hit Kiev and the region around the capital, the Black Sea port, Odessa, and central Ukraine. Powerful explosions shook Kiev early on Sunday after officials warned of a possible ballistic missile attack. The alert just before 4 a.m. urged people to take over immediately. Moments later, several loud blasts were heard, according to reports. Vladimir Zelensky says real opportunities to end war with dignity still exist, calling for another round of talks and hinting at a fresh leaders' meeting. After he was debriefed on this week's peace talks with Russia and the US in Geneva, Zelensky called for another round of talks to be held very soon, as early as this February. He said Ukraine's responses to the most difficult questions ahead of the next meeting are ready, and they still want to raise some issues at the leaders' level with Trump and Putin. It is the leaders' format they could prove decisive in many respects, and the Ukraine is ready for such a format, he said.
Yeah, I mean, this feels like a very long game of chess without a clear idea again of how this ends. Putin is obviously waiting out and has essentially Trump's support. For me, the most worrying dimension of it is the fact that the real cruelty and harm and damage just carries on and is effectively not that much in the media anymore. It's not that interesting. People are continuing to be killed and taken prisoner, etc., and there have been prisoner exchanges and so forth. But we at the European level, the fact that there is not unanimity, there is not total agreement across the EU, is making this very hard, because the EU has the scale of resources actually to help Ukraine carry on to a successful, whatever that means, successful outcome. But the Orban and also Slovakia are undermining that, and we know Orban is a kind of Putin ally and a US ally. And so behind the scenes there are these trading issues around oil and gas, etc., which are complicating matters. But it would be fantastic to see the EU actually act much more coherently. But I don't know what it does, because it's built its whole kind of governance model around agreement and consensus. Yeah. And when two and maybe more of the members of the group are facing in a different direction and actively undermining it, it's very hard for that to come to a sensible conclusion. The idea that Putin, apparently with US support, thinks that it's okay to expect Ukraine to give up land that it hasn't actually lost, as well as that which is currently occupied by Russian forces, is just completely bonkers and defies any sort of rational process. But whether or not we end up with a kind of end of World War I or even end of World War II negotiated process that allows micro-trading to happen within a bigger context still depends on the leadership agreeing now have to settle this. Whereas it's felt like, particularly from the Russian side with US support, a pretty fraudulent process thus far.
And also, is the sanctions working?
I think they've worked in part because it has restricted Russia's ability to do a variety of things. But they still have a certain amount of flexibility. They're clearly getting support from China, from North Korea, from India, from others that are providing both weaponry and financial and other support. So this is messy. It's very, very messy. But the fact that almost in the same place 4 years on is pretty tragic, really, for the people of Ukraine, especially going through winter. Things will maybe improve somewhat, but there have been hundreds of thousands of people left in frozen apartments and under threat of nightly attack.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty ugly situation. But again, I really wish I could see a way forward, but I really don't.
Yeah, we'll go back to Huw. Huw.
Yeah, it's just so I don't say depressing, but what Campbell was saying again. I agree completely. We have Steve Witkoff, who's the negotiator, who's again a real estate sort of expert or whatever he is. He's been to Moscow on multiple occasions, 6, 7, possibly 8 times. And I think last week was the first time he'd actually visited Ukraine, which in itself speaks volumes. But I think it's worth reflecting. It's 4 years, and it's just remarkable the resilience of the Ukrainian people. How they're managing to cope with what's going on. This constant bombardment, because as we know, Russia are attacking Ukrainian infrastructure. Whereas the Ukrainians are trying to defend their lands and trying to sort of repel invaders. It is a very one-sided battle. As Campbell was saying, there's 10,000 North Korean troops there. And one of the things I didn't sort of appreciate until this week is those North Korean troops are actually being taught now how to combat this kind of activity in war. So they're actually using it as a training ground for North Korea, and we all know how potentially dangerous North Korea is. But yeah, I just really feel for the Ukrainian people. I think the EU and the UK can do more. But I think, again, linking back to the Epstein files, I think a lot has been said around the Epstein files with a focus originally on sex trafficking and the despicable things that Epstein and Maxwell were found guilty of. But what's coming out now is the amount of influence that him and his network had in destabilising sort of Western democracy. It's clear that people like Bannon and Farage, were part of this sort of cabal that were trying to destabilise the European Union, and the only country that's going to benefit from that is Russia. And I think there's going to be a lot more of this coming out, and I think this is going to hopefully have an impact on Farage and Reform when more people realise how involved he and his girlfriend, who again is named in the Epstein files as one of the people involved in the organisation who've been trying to destabilise the EU over a number of years. Brexit being a prime example of that. So so huge respect to the people of Ukraine, and hopefully the coming months and what's coming out now in the news will sort of hopefully shed light on what was actually going on behind the scenes to destabilise and benefit Russia.
Thank you. I'll move on. Yeah.
Okay, I was just going to say one little thing, agreeing with you there. I think Zelensky deserves enormous credit, frankly, because he's been undermined from outside, he's been undermined from within, and I mean he is dealing with political diversity within Ukraine anyway. The mayor of Kyiv comes from a very different sort of background from him, but he has thus far, against all of these odds, he's managed to sort of hold things together. Now, I know that arguably his democratic legitimacy declines because it's so long since elections were held. But it would be a madness to try and hold elections under these circumstances. So I think he doesn't get a lot of credit, partly because of the right-wing filtering of the mainstream media and the way in which America frames this. But actually, the poor man has done, in my view, an extraordinarily solid job in protecting his people as best he could against insuperable odds, arguably.
Thank you for that point, and we will move on and we will come back. After the US Supreme Court declared Trump's tariffs illegal, Trump responded by attacking the Supreme Court and by announcing new 15% tariffs on all countries. His attacks were personal and raised questions about Trump's understanding of the separation of powers and the US Constitution. Thank you.
Where to start with Trump's tantrums? I mean, attacking the Supreme Court in the past would have been something that simply would not have been done. You know, criticising members of the Supreme Court, including people that he had appointed. I mean, clearly, when you are appointed by Trump, you are meant completely to agree with everything he does, says, thinks about everything, and probably buy his Bitcoin and do everything else that he wants as well. I mean, it is a. I can't be polite, so I probably should be briefer. But the nature of what has happened is just absolutely crazy. He has now put in place initially 10%, now 15% new tariffs, which will only last, I think, 150 days or something like that. Again, they're meant to go through congressional process, and I doubt if they will, although the Congress has proved itself to be pretty supine, even on issues where there has been apparent agreement and legitimacy to the lines that are being pursued. So this is just another part of the Trump crazy takeover. I cannot see any line of sensible behaviour here. So there will be resistance. It's creating confusion and chaos for global trading again. There are clearly now signs of opposition and resistance actually becoming more coherent, and spines being discovered by people that seem to not have them previously. But it's so difficult because of the efforts in Trump 1 of disabling various institutions and the efforts that have continued. I wonder, the court did not say anything about what should happen.
Yeah, and the refunds.
Exactly, having struck these as illegal actions.
But the bigger companies, that's the problem again. The smaller companies, they will find it difficult to get the refund at the last. We have to discuss this with Huw as well.
Course, yes.
Huw, and we were discussing, and I will give you time, and if I can include one thing about the refund, how the refund is going to happen for the companies, those who are legitimate to get the refund, and the smaller companies, they will. I would like you to discuss about the smaller companies and the big companies, like if you can.
Yeah, because it's quite interesting. Because obviously some sort of governors of some states are now making those compensation claims. But I think what they're doing is actually making the compensation claims on behalf of the individuals. So people who've had to pay, the extra money through the tariffs. Because as we know, sort of Trump with his nonsensical sort of business ramblings. Thinks the tariffs are a great thing. The reality is it's a tax on American people, and it's a way of trying to stifle sort of global trade, making sort of non-US products more expensive and less attractive to US customers. So I think it is going to be interesting, because I don't think it's the actual companies per se who are looking for the compensation. It's going to be the American public who have had to pay extra for these. But I think it is interesting when you look at Trump. He was quite sort of crestfallen, when he had the announcement came out, because obviously he was expecting it, and I think he knows that he can put these tariffs in place for a limited period of time, 150 days, and he'll just do this and roll it forward until I think that he was looking at the number of days that would take it up to November 28, which we all know is the end of his presidency. So I don't know. It's a mess. I think it's a mess for America, but it also makes us realise that we've got to look at our own economy in the UK. But again, how that fits in as part of the EU economy, that obviously that's had a huge element of harm on us through Brexit. Because remember, the US economy is worth, I think, around 30 trillion per year. Well, the EU economy is worth 20, and the UK economy is worth 4. So there's not a huge difference there between the EU and UK economy and the US economy. So there is potential here, for non-US countries, like Japan, Canada, Australia, Brazil, and such like to work together to actually counter the US economically. But it takes. I think people just need to stand up to Trump, and there's been far too much pandering to his ego, and up to now. But I think what we're going to see from Trump is basically he's going to try and fill his pockets as much as he can between now and November 2028.
Yeah, thank you. Would you like to add something?
Just to say about that was important to talk about the sort of private sector element, but I think there's also the public sector domain in terms of individuals that they were seriously harmed by what was going on, and just seemingly randomly going back onto higher levels of tariff just creates those additional trading complications. But that makes the markets react as well, because they're wondering about what the medium and longer term interest rates and
very true.
It just complicates everything. Now, I think this is part of Trump's agenda. I mean, it's the kind of joke about squirrel. It's distract, constantly come up with something.
Instability in the market.
Yeah, it confuses everybody. So if he has an investment deal that is worth supporting, then people, he hopes, will pile into that. Especially when he's criticising people who are not supporting him. So it's. We have never had, I suppose, we have had in imperial pasts. I suppose we have had in imperial pasts individual personalities and the cult around them having such a dominant impact. But this is, I think, pretty much unprecedented, and it's certainly unprecedented within the US context. So it sets a very interesting scene for what comes next, for November. It's going to be absolutely fascinating.
I know, yeah. Despite there being no sign of any blue tents at any royal palaces, police have been searching the homes of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor for evidence of allegations of misconduct in a public office. As this is now a live legal case, have the investigations effectively shut down any prospects of Andrew Mountbatten testifying to the US Congress? I will ask Huw on this.
Yeah, you've got to be careful what you say when we discuss these elements. But I think one of the most interesting things that's come out of the last few days was the interviews with the Dimbleby brothers, because you've got two brothers there that are at almost polar opposites. I can't remember which one's which now. You've got Richard and Jonathan. So one is a close friend of the king, is a close confidant of the king and speaks to him on a regular basis. And the other one isn't. And he was saying, that basically the one thing the brothers never discuss is the royal family. But the point being made is how the royal family are reported, because they are just being reported. The BBC, as an example, just broadcast what the royal family want to say. It's very rarely that you find them actually discussing the royal family from a sort of investigative or critical point of view. And I think that's a really important point, and it's one of the reasons why I think people like Andrew seemingly have been getting away from it for such a long time, because they were genuinely seen as being above the not above the law, but above being sort of reported on and being questioned and challenged, to see what happens. And obviously the allegations surrounding this are around his role as a a global sort of trade ambassador, and also his pitch at the palace, which was a big part of his um, sort of operations. And to be fair, the number of people I know in Wales were critical of organisations and universities who welcomed Andrew and Pitch of the Palace, because a lot of these allegations have been going around for many years. It's not a new thing. Questions have been asked about his role, about him going on foreign trips, disappearing for a number of days, at the sort of taxpayers' expense. So I think it does call now for greater transparency of the royal family, better actual reporting of the royal family rather than just being mouthpieces for the royal family. And I think this is also asked the question is, why on earth have we got a royal family? In this day and age, they are just normal people who are there due to their birthright, due to some sort of bizarre historical consequence. And it does make you wonder, what is the role and the purpose of a royal family in the world that we live in today.
The sort of discussion about the US and the way in which the Trump clan is behaving. But the Dimblebys are also a pretty highly respected, allegedly, dynasty in these islands. And Richard, the father, was a kind of heroic figure in the earlier years of broadcasting. I think I'm certainly with David, who has come out with he actually called it that there was a conspiracy between the media and the royal family, effectively to portray only that which the royal family wanted. Now, Jonathan is a biographer and friend of Charles, and surprisingly has a rather different view that is rather more supportive of the monarchy. But I agree with you. I mean, it is thoroughly and utterly anachronistic. And again, in the US context, it's really funny to be a Republican in Scotland, but very opposed to the Republicans in the US. Yeah. But anyway, it's another strange and complicated situation, given that we're now in legal process. And the ironies of the governance model and the institutions of the UK comes to the fore straight away, because presumably after the police investigation is concluded or reaches a certain point, it goes to the Crown Prosecution Service. The Crown Prosecution Service in England that will then, at a certain point, it goes to the Crown Prosecution Service. The Crown Prosecution Service in England that will then explore whether or not a case should be taken further forward. Now, the process could be very interesting because technically and historically, these cases could end up being discussed in the House of Lords as the court of highest order, other than the Supreme Court, which existed only after the Lords had existed. So we have this arcane mess around the way in which Britain is run. But we're coming to a point where I think there was a great deal of respect for Charles's mother. The Queen held a generally positive aura around her, but we're also discovering that there may well have been things that she did know or chose not to know, or her courtiers chose not to tell her, etc., etc. So we are going to be peeling back layers, and in the current world of social media, between those different worlds, it's not just about trade policy and who was an advocate or not. We've got Mandelson, we've got the Epstein files, and the culture of those very powerful rich men that were connected between media. Maxwell's father had a rather interesting role in the history of media. There's Murdoch, there's power in the US and the UK and elsewhere. And then there's the actual political processes. And then beyond that, there's the law and how that works. And we're seeing seedy complexities that tie various people together across all of this. So we again are entering a very interesting phase, and irrespective of what happens in the Andrew case, I mean, I think coof is one of the nicest words you could possibly use to describe him. But he is someone who has a long record of using his power in a not entirely appropriate manner. So it will be very interesting to see if the undermining his power in a not entirely appropriate manner. So it will be very interesting to see if the undermining of respect for the royal family and the institutions of governance that and fealty and allegiance that lie around that, whether that begins now properly to crumble, as some of us believe it should. It seems wholly inappropriate in these times.
Yeah. Thank you. We'll move on to the next topic. Voters in Manchester for the polls in the Gorton and Denton by-election this week. Could what would have been a safe Labour seat could Reform win, or will tactical voting halt their momentum in the media? I'll go to Huw first, and then I'll come back to you. Huw?
Yeah, I think Gorton and Denton, there's many similarities with the last sort of major by-election that happened here in Wales, which was the Caerphilly Senedd by-election that was contested just before Christmas. It followed the sad passing of Dr. Hefin David, who had been the Labour representative, and it was seen as a two-horse race between Plaid Cymru and Reform. I think what's interesting is that Labour's support, we see that Wales, from polling and from anecdotal reports from, doorstep canvassing that all political parties are having, including the Labour parties, their support has collapsed. And it seems to be sort of falling even further, I think, in Starmer. Whatever Starmer does or says, it doesn't seem to be helping their case. And I think in the case of the election that's happening next this Thursday, I think the fact that the Greens are seen as that alternative to Reform, because obviously what people on the doorstep are saying is they want somebody who can represent them, in Westminster, but they also, large section of society want to stop Reform. There's a, even though Farage seems to think that he is popular, he's popular with, a small percentage of the UK population, but the vast majority dislike him greatly. So I think, the Greens have got an opportunity here to take this. I think, Polanski's been quite fortunate that he's been getting some good PR over the last few weeks. I think Reform have got an incredibly bad candidate who is, bordering on, being insane. So, hopefully we will see that, it's getting people to turn out, making people, motivated to stop Reform. And it looks like the Green Party are best placed to do that. But I do, it'll be interesting to see. But I don't know, there's a feeling, I think, that Reform are potentially on the wane. I think what's been happening recently with, senior Tory people sort of shifting over, Tories, his new, cabinet in waiting that doesn't include, people who are actually elected members of Parliament at the moment, and covers a very narrow, slew of policy areas. Because obviously, the one thing that Reform haven't got are policies. So, they're fighting on, the basis of small boats and immigration. And as we know, immigration numbers are falling dramatically. So, their one shtick, I suppose, is and it's hopefully it will harm them. But, fingers crossed that Reform don't win. But there is a danger, obviously, because how the progressive left, Green, Labour, Lib Dem vote will make a difference. So hopefully people will just realise that the most important thing is stopping Reform, and the best way of doing that is voting Green.
Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, I find it very hard to disagree with you there. I think constitutionally we're also in an intriguing sort of place, because historically, because of the Westminster first past the post system, parties like the Greens can have significant support in the country, but just not enough to win individual seats outright. But the rule book is kind of being chucked away at this point. Things are beginning to look very different, even although, frankly, we've had a kind of cut and paste from the right wing of the Conservative Party into Reform. And we've seen the kind of limp economic right-wing strategies from them, plus their racism, and gradually I think people are beginning to see through that and realise that there is a huge problem with it, and the one-man front show of Farage is just deeply unpleasant and actually not very British, in a weird sort of way. But the bigger issue for me probably is that such has been the period, probably from before Boris, but probably from Cameron actually, and from the original approaches to the referenda, that a lot of the British public are just really fed up. They've seen venal politicians, self-interest, lies. They promise something and then don't deliver it. And that's happened serially. And it's been exposed probably more quickly and more openly than in the past. So why should I vote for these people? Because they're just going to more openly than in the past. So why should I vote for these people? Because they're just going to lie to me.
Talking about the lie, the one thing Farage said last year was not to trust Tories. Yeah. And he took all the Tories the next year and his own party.
Exactly. So
that is lie to his own supporters.
Yeah, but I mean, like Trump, they don't remember their previous lies or their previous statements. So they're not really being held to account for that. But I think they probably will be increasingly, because the public is not stupid. They will see this is what's been said, and then hang on, we've just done a handbrake turn and come out with something that goes completely against that. But I think in the Gorton and Denton, as well as potentially in the upcoming elections for the Senedd and Holyrood, etc., there is a real danger of apathy. There is a real danger of the public saying, stuff it, they're none of them to be trusted. And we desperately need to get people engaged again. Now, I think there is a younger demographic that potentially...
By-election in Wales,
yeah,
where Plaid Cymru has won.
Yeah.
So what do you think, like the Greens' chance and Gorton and Denton?
Yeah, I think the Greens do have a real chance, but I think it will depend at least partly on turnout and whether or not reform does
the tactical voting
mobilise.
may happen.
Tactical voting, I'm almost certain, will happen. Whether or not it will make enough of a difference, either way, I don't know. But it's going to be really interesting to watch, because I think it will give us some clues as to what is upcoming elsewhere.
And the demographics of that particular constituency is 50-50 or 60-40, I guess.
Yeah.
So hope they will come out and vote.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if Huw is closer to that in terms of what has happened in Wales as well. Where is the vote changing more? Because I find it quite hard to work that out.
Huw, would you like to
So with Caerphilly, for example, because I was in Caerphilly on the day of the election talking to people within Plaid Cymru, and they genuinely didn't know what the result was going to be. I think the general feeling was that they'd done a good campaign, but probably because of Farage's multiple visits and the sort of the wider sort of national coverage that Reform were getting, that they would probably lose. So when the result came out, it was a resounding victory. It was the majority of 4,500. But what it later transpired was, obviously there was an element of protest, people voting to keep Reform out, but it was the youth vote apparently that did make a huge difference. So young people dislike Reform and far more proactive in their dislike of them, and actually did it by registering and voting. So I think that will be a big difference. But what we're seeing is, sort of the vote for Reform is basic. It's on the right, Conservative, moving over. There is this theory around people who hadn't voted in the past, but those are the ones who came out in the Brexit vote and voted because they'd actually found a party that resonated with them. But saying only a vote for Labour can stop Reform, which was patent nonsense. I think Labour came fourth, almost lost their deposits. So I think there is a shift, and I think people, because obviously there's been a huge amount of work. Because I was reading about Polanski going to the constituency 2 weeks ago on a Saturday, and they'd ask people to come, Green Party supporters from the area, local area, and wider to come there to help the campaign. and I think probably about 1,000 people turn up. They've had very lots of support on the ground. And the other thing, the fact that Reform are going out and they've got the funds to be able to just post letters to and leaflets to everybody. So it does actually work against Reform, I think, in the long term, because a lot of people are actually seeing their message and disliking it, and it's actually motivating them to say, "Christ, we can't have this. We've got to, we've got to have an alternative." So I think Reform, to a certain extent, are their own worst enemy.
Here, on that point, we will go to the next topic, which is something similar. Leading up to this, with polls showing the SNP likely to be the largest party in Scottish elections, could independence be defeated by complacency, low turnout, and tactical voting? In Wales, Plaid Cymru looks set to defeat Reform. Would you like to go?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a logical continuation of that previous conversation.
Yeah.
I hope not, is the long and short of it, i.e. that there is not complacency and a low turnout. I think it will make a huge difference if people are very focused on how important this is, and actually appreciate that this is a really interesting moment in the politics of the United Kingdom. I think we know that the forces at the centre holding that traditional vibe of unity in the Union are currently under threat and being weakened. And the parties that have been in charge, or at least in office for extended periods, have not delivered the benefits that they have promised, and have frequently shackled and now are threatening the roles of the devolved institutions. We've seen the demographics in Northern Ireland gradually changing. So we do have this prospect of 3 of the member nations of the Union not facing inward, but facing towards themselves, not facing inward to the Union, I mean. And that, for some of us, that's a very welcome thing. It would be good if it were more about the appeal and attraction of what's on offer in an independent context, rather than a reaction to and a distaste for the Union and its institutions. And maybe we're kind of close to a pivot there. I would certainly like to see stronger messaging, and of course the state media don't help with this. It's very difficult to get honest, decent stories out there. And a lot of what's been coming out of Reform has, up until relatively recently, simply not been challenged. There has not been that fact-checking process. So we've had Trump-esque lines being pushed, which are just nonsense. They're simply not true. But you need to have a media voice to be able, in real time, to argue with that. So my earnest hope, and at this point still my expectation, is that in Scotland and in Wales we see really positive outcomes where the unionist parties are seen for what the London organs that do neither know nor understand the aspirations of the patches that they allegedly represent.
Yeah. Huw?
Yeah, I think it is interesting. So obviously Wales is in a different sort of position to Scotland. I think Wales are having what Scotland had almost 20 years ago with the SNP, people realising that, there was an alternative to Labour and voting the SNP in the numbers that they did. Because when you look at Wales, when asking people, how are they going to vote, and why are they supporting Plaid Cymru? 2 main reasons. The main reason is Plaid Cymru are the best party to stand up for the interests of the people of Wales. And secondary then is that they're the best party placed to stop reform. I think the days of people. I think people obviously have seen Labour on a national level in Wales. They've had 25, 26 years of Labour, and the country isn't any better off following that Labour administration. And the fact that that at the last general election, people were saying, well, if you vote Labour, we're going to have, 2 parties at both ends of the M4, working closely together. And what's happened since then is that the Labour Party in London have just sort of ignored their Welsh colleagues. We've looked at things like HS2 and devolving, the part of that funding from Barnet Consequentials. Every single local authority in Wales, all 22, I think there is, have passed motions asking for the Crown estates to be devolved. It's devolved in Scotland. It isn't in Wales. So Welsh Government, Labour, and Plaid Cymru, Lib Dems and Greens all want the Crown estate devolved, and Labour in London are saying, no, you can't have it. It's not a priority. It's not important. So they're just ignoring what people in Wales are saying. And Starmer does play badly on the doorstep. He's him and Reeves. They're deeply unpopular. That people just can't relate to them. And I think it was interesting, obviously, with Sawa, with his, I stand by my comments. I think he thought he was going to be this sort of knight in shining armour who is going to take down Starmer, but he sort of miscalculated that so massively. You almost feel sorry for him. Eluned Morgan didn't come out at the time to show her support for Starmer, and in interviews, when asked if she thinks that Starmer is a good Prime Minister, she's refused to answer that question, which basically means she doesn't think he is. But she's come out, sort of supporting Starmer, but again, under the auspices of he needs to listen and he needs to give Wales stuff. So the fact that they can't even deliver on behalf of their own party in Wales speaks volumes. I doubt that we'll see Starmer in Wales during the election campaign. People, in places, I live in an ex-coal mining community in the South Wales Valleys. People here, it's where the Labour Party was founded. People have voted, we're going back to places where they used to weigh the votes rather than count them. That's just disappeared. The amount of older people, who voted Labour all their lives are now saying that they're not going to vote Labour. They dislike reform, and Plaid Cymru, have got to be given an opportunity to. But I think the other thing is young people. Thankfully, polling shows that younger generations in Wales and Scotland, support independence to a much higher percentage than us old folk. And I think it's a matter of time. It's a direction of travel, and I think we will see. Probably not in my lifetime, but hopefully within this next sort of 50, 60 years, younger people will just say that being independent is normal. Why are we being told by Westminster what to do when we could be doing it ourselves? But yeah, I don't think independence is a big thing on the doorstep. A lot of people, again, scared of independence because, how can we afford it? Our economy and, standard of living in Wales is rubbish at the moment. It's going to be worse if we become independent. So, there's lots of arguments to be made and need to be won in that point of view. But, if the fact is being independent is normal. And I think that's the thing, and younger people realise that.
In terms of Scotland, do you think low turnout will be the case of diminishing the case for independence?
I think it might be in some constituencies, to be honest. I think it will depend on just how effective the candidates are in animating interest locally. And I think there are some groups that are dominated more by younger voters that will potentially do much better. Getting the old going to be quite challenging.
So turnout is going to be...
I don't know if it will be, but it's going to be crucial. I don't know if it's going to be low, sorry, to anticipate your question. But I hope that I hope that it isn't. I hope people realise just how significant this is. I think Hugh's points about the sort of experience of Labour, Wales is obviously following a sort of echo path of what happened in Scotland to some extent. That, lots of promises, lots of loyalty, lots of weighed rather than counted votes, the same sort of philosophy. But actually, lots of promises broken, lots of, things that simply did not work. Even leading up to the election, we'll protect Grangemouth, we'll do this, we'll do that, and actually they didn't. And the support for the WASPy women, etc. I know yesterday was a fabulous rugby day, one way or another, although Huw might disagree with that slightly. But in footballing terms, Sarwar was just extraordinary because he was suddenly played offside. I think he thought he was in a groove and something might work.
But he was
suddenly,
promising, if I may say, he was promising in earlier 2025 that like if he become the first minister, like he can get everything from the Westminster and he will be the best pal of Westminster. But Huw was saying that was not the case in Wales.
no, absolutely not. Exactly.
Yeah.
So again, it was a hollow promise.
Yeah.
It's a thing of convenience, to have Scottish leaders of any kind within the Labour movement now. Once upon a time, leaders from Wales and Scotland would have been listened to as the authorities within the Labour Party. But the sort of metropolitanisation, if we call it that, of the Labour Party has, I think, in the long run, has screwed them effectively. It's sad maybe to say it in that way, but I think it is. And I mean, Starmer coming to Scotland or Wales, I suspect, is very similar to Boris Johnson. It's like, no, please don't, because it just makes things worse. I suspect Plaid Cymru and the SNP will be quite happy to have Starmer in Scotland because it actually has a beneficial effect to the vote. I don't know what will happen with the reform vote, because there had been some really terrifying switches of people who we thought were supportive of various causes who have switched right across to reform. So that kind of, I think, almost ill tactical voting is worrying and will be relevant to what happens next. Yeah. But I think this is an interesting and important time. I think there is enough of an appreciation that the populace has been failed by the parties on whom they have relied, and that is a potential alleyway that reform could come in through, but only if people ignore their racism, their hopeless policies, and the fact that they've basically just taken on some of the worst of the Conservative Party.
And you have mentioned drawn towards reform, and they have been very enthusiastic about the upcoming election. What can the independent supporting parties to do that to their supporters to come out and vote? This is a question to you as well as Huw, because in Welsh election we have seen the people coming out and voting, and are we going to see that in the upcoming Parliament elections?
Yeah, I think, again, just going back to Caerphilly, I have to apologise to the Labour candidate who I said came in fourth and almost lost his deposit. He did actually come third, and with 11%, so he didn't almost lose his deposit. But when you consider the position that Labour had come from originally, the turnout in Caerphilly was over 50%, which is very, very high for a by-election and very, very high for a Senate election. But again, I think it was the fact that Reform were trying to compete there is what actually drove people out to vote and to vote against Reform. And I think, again, Reform potentially could be their own worst enemy. They don't have the ground campaign compared with other political parties to be able to go out and knock on doors. What they do have is the money to be able to send numerous electoral addresses out to people across Wales and Scotland, which they will do. Another thing I think was going to harm Reform is the decision to not cancel the local elections in around 30 local authorities in England, because that's going to pull resources from what they were going to do in Wales and Scotland, because obviously their focus is on England, and I think they're more interested in gaining those local authorities than they are in actually gaining power in Wales. And leaflets through the door from Reform that is basically, stop the boats, and they change their mind on policies. The two-child cap, they're for it, they're against it, they're for it, they're against it. They're for it, but with a bit of racism thrown in. I think, that they're being seen now as not being serious when it comes to being a political party. And I think, hopefully, that will drive people to vote. And I think, on the doorstep, I think people are aware of what's going on, of the elections coming up. I think the fact that Labour are at historically low levels of support across the UK. Obviously, we don't have the sort of the sectarian sort of element in Wales, where you have people voting along sort of unionist on religious sort of grounds. So there's a slight difference there. But I think in general, people have just had enough of Labour. They've had enough, obviously, Labour. They've had enough, obviously, clearly had enough of the Conservatives. And the vast majority of people dislike Reform hugely. So I think, it's the stars are aligning for Plaid Cymru. If they do well at this election, then, they never will. But there's a genuine chance that Plaid Cymru could form the next government, and they will form one as a minority administration, rather than going into coalition with another party, because one of the criticisms they've had is that they've been in coalition with Labour, which is true, but the fact they've been in coalition allowed for more progressive policies to be enacted, which is like the grown-up way of doing politics. But the public don't see that; they just see as Labour and Plaid being the same side of the same coin. So yeah, interesting times ahead, but I think it'll be interesting to see how Reform perform. I was looking at some local by-election results, because obviously, on a Thursday, local by-elections, you see sort of Britain elects, the results come out on social media. Reform have been winning almost every one they've been doing. The last few weeks, they haven't been winning. Their percentage of votes in places where you think they would do well, is like 13-15%. So is the sort of desire for reform, is this Conservative, as Campbell was saying, it's not the fact that they're getting the best of the Conservatives, they're getting the absolute worst, the dregs of the Conservative Party, ones of the Conservative Party, but actually it's his new, front row team, and showing that, he wasn't just the one-man band. 25 questions were asked, they were all answered by Farage. He didn't allow anybody else to answer it. And, it just shows you the level of, one-man showmanship there is. So, yeah, hopefully we'll see.
Thank you so much, and it's time for us to wind up. Well, that's it for this first full Scottish from our new studio in Stirling. Before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. We can only exist with your support. Our programs will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, and please donate whatever you can afford. Thank you, and thank you again to our guests, Campbell Gemmell and Huw Marshall. Thank you. Goodbye, and thank you for watching.